Welcome, everyone. This is such a great event. We have, obviously, as you can see, an extraordinary group of talented people advancing citizen assemblies in North America. And, big thank you to Fide, Marjan, Nick, Local Progress. This is such a great event, and I can't wait to learn from all these people. So without further ado, let's get going.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be back again. I'm going to talk about a project of ours from a couple years ago that I apologize if you've heard about this before. We've been using it as an example for a while because it has good materials and because the city invested a bunch of money in it, so it has kind of all the bells and whistles. But that's kind of a disclaimer up front that this is a near $500,000 project. We've done many that are a quarter that size, and there are some, as we've heard, that are 10 times that size. So these come in all kinds of different varieties. In fact, we're really enthusiastic about working on at the very, very small level in rural areas. So if you're interested in that, talk to me. And we're looking for grants for that too. Okay, this was in Petaluma, California. In May, 2 months was the total panel time in 2022. And it was called the Petaluma Fairgrounds Advisory Panel. So just a little background on this project. It was around a 55-acre fairground site in the center of town, probably the most contentious issue in the city. This is a city of 60,000, by the way, about an hour north of the Bay Area. And seemingly everybody in the city is a stakeholder. When the city made a stakeholder list, it was like 150 names or organizations in 12 categories. The panel was 36 residents, age 16 and up. Used seven demographic factors, worked for 12 total full 8-hour work days, spread just over 2 months, so like 5 weekends, sort of mixed and matched, and produced 3 reports. One, a kind of values principles report, one, what we called pathways, but really was more like site use options. Each of these prioritized, and then a final report that sort of combined these options and principles together and wrote a narrative, essentially resulting in kind of halfway through the policymaking process at the point of kind of very light alternatives. So not into really site planning, but just sort of jump-starting at that point, really stalled process between the city and the fairgrounds, and also a very bilateral process over a property that really belonged to everyone and everyone really cared about. A little bit more about the background, the political background. The city owns this land and had been renting it to a state-appointed fair board for $1 a year for 50 years, and I think previous to that as well. And there was controversy about whether that should be renewed, whether the city should take back, control over that property, whether there should be, it should be sold to developers and housing built on it, et cetera, you can imagine. A classic, could not be a more textbook planning side of question. Okay. I think the next slide here is actually, if it plays, a video. That was recorded sort of in the middle of the process. As you can tell, they're still in the midst of working on these kind of site options. And it's part of a longer little mini documentary that you can see on YouTube if you'd like. I'm going to walk through kind of the progression timeline-wise here. So remember, this is only a 2-month process for the actual panel, but the whole thing lasted for about a year. And by the way, that 2 months was not our choice at all. That was really down to the political situation and the need for the city to take a first kind of step on the decision, the first decision on this property on a certain timeline, and that sort of backs up to a staff report, which backs up to the need for this engagement to happen. And I should say, actually, just one other thing about the setup, which is that the city's main goal in this was to sort of unstick a process where there had been these two sort of warring entities, the city and the fair. So the city was in this weird position of kind of being a stakeholder, although not having a position, having a lot of diversity among itself and among council, but yet also being seen as kind of an antagonist by some people, a few people in the community. So that's a weird political situation that I can talk a little bit more about that has legitimacy consequences. So this is the setup. There was a bunch of work, to set up the panel. There was a city council authorization and then a selection process, which lasted about 2.5 months, which is about normal for us. Then the panel went through a sort of its stages here. You can see where the reports came out. And then there was ongoing panel work in this process that involved, actually, I'll talk about that in a second. At the same time, there were some other things happening. There was a stakeholder committee, we call it an information committee, that was curating information, making a giant menu, annotated of various folks that the panel could select from for additional information, and also making rules about the small amounts of written information that would come at the beginning of the process from the fair and from the city. And also stakeholders were involved in a feedback loop later, at least maybe two, a survey. There was also another survey, and there was a workshop event for the general public. And there were also, 40 plus various presentations, some of those selected in advance by that committee and some, most by the panel. There were also another sort of engagement for the panel recognized that there were insufficient sort of representatives from marginalized communities that they had heard from, and so they requested sort of a special panel later on. And then this sort of preceded a bunch of city-led, more traditional engagement workshops and town halls and things like that, and an event, sort of an open house. Yeah, here's first day of the panel, I believe. In not a great room, to be honest. Had great natural light, but very echoey. So I'm going to go through just very quickly some process elements here. So these are sort of based on our kind of 5 core values. And on the left-hand side is going to be kind of standard elements, and on the right-hand side is going to be some unique elements, or less standard elements to this project. So inclusivity. There was a mailing to 10,000 addresses, and a promise of the equivalent of $20 an hour, all those personalized services and simultaneous interpretation throughout. On representation, there was a public event. It sort of opened the process. This panel, we've talked about those things already. Less common, the city council decided to use equity-based over-selection based on their previous city mandate to use equity in everything they do. I should have mentioned that yesterday, that's typically where that comes from. So they decided to use youth demographics where possible and compensate for disparities in previous participation in a comp planning process that this was kind of a part of. On integrity, some standard elements, a research-based design process, transparent, and I can talk about the balance between transparency and privacy. Also, on the tables is just a small selection from the 50-page proposal that has all the details about this project. What's not in there is the transparency and privacy or the other policy sections, but that's in your online materials. And independent evaluation. There were 4 researchers there, including Marjan, thanks so much, who produced a lovely report about it that you should also go read. And less common elements, this one, at least for us, included a much more robust process for informational inputs. This is something that we're really in the most development over, and we think there's the least sort of the most need for development in our field, is the way that information comes into the process. And so there was this stakeholder committee that was actually, it had these 100 and some members in 12 categories, and we selected from those different categories actually by lottery. That wasn't a perfect system, but I can talk about it later, but that was very much to protect against charges of bias, because somehow we had to select among all these folks that all believed that they were essential to the process. Small group tables on the other side of that room. We all know what that looks like. Let's see, last item here. No, second to last, collaboration. Standard elements, structural, iterative process, professional moderation, of course, group cohesion built by sort of all hands on deck info gathering phase, and a really extensive one in this case that really covered quite a few hours up front. And the less common elements, this is a public work listening session hosted by the panel itself, importantly. They were small group table facilitators at that point, note takers, which was a lovely like power dynamic kind of thing that they were sort of in charge of the room. That's this event, the public event here. This is my colleague Alex. We're just hanging out at the back, which is so nice. On empowerment, the panel had as much authority over its own process as possible via internal governance mechanisms, and 100% authority of its own output down to the very last typo, and decision makers committed to formally responding to the recommendations. those are all standard, but the less common elements were that there was a really robust subcommittee system. This is another thing that we're developing, and this is sort of the I think this evolution actually is gonna probably stick for the next process. This had 4 subcommittees that everybody belonged to and were semi-self-selected. People kind of prioritized. One was that oversaw the process, and eventually, actually, after the process ended, designed an extra charrette that they found local architects and did some design work to be able to sort of visualize their work, which was meant to be part of the process, actually, but they didn't know that. They came up with this on their own, and we were like, oh, that was actually meant to be part of it. We had to skip it because of a COVID outbreak that limited the amount of time. So that was cool. Evaluation committee that worked with researchers, an outreach committee that was sort of told the panel's own story, was their in-house sort of PR firm, and a policy impact committee that worked with decision makers later on to sort of talk about their recommendations, answer questions. They produced a little booklet on how to read the final report for policymakers. And very quickly on, how am I on time? End? Close? Okay. Wrap it up. You'll see the full budget on your page, so on the page there. We can talk about that later. But suffice to say, about a quarter of the project went fully to panelists as payment, and most of the rest of it is panelist services, and that's actually on the low end for us. I think, yeah, yeah. 4th picture there is the outcome for us. The project. That's what the final report looks like. You can see that on the website. And the results really, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the major key result and the desire at the outset was to restart a conversation that had been stalled and broaden it out from this sort of bilateral conversation of these 2 warring parties. And I think it did that right away. The city council meeting right after the event was completely different than the city council at the beginning. Everybody on both sides stood up and thanked the panel for their work and talked about how much they love this idea and how much the panelists, have really put in time. And I think that's really what the city manager has said is kind of like, the first main outcome aside from the policy recommendations. I'll stop there. Thanks much.